There are two people that come to mind when it comes to the evolution of radio in Canada. These two exalted chaps of historical note are Guglielmo Marconi and Reginald Fessenden. If you've heard of one but not the other, fear not, you're in good company. If you've heard of both of these guys, well, that makes you a nerd, and you, my friend, need a hobby. From an early age, Marconi became obsessed with the idea of being able to communicate with others over long distances. As a native-born Italian from Bologna, Italy, yelling came naturally to the young man, and he must have marveled at the ability to reach out from his bedroom clear to the kitchen without actually having to get out of bed. However, what if you wanted to yell at somebody on the other end of the Atlantic? Marconi became consumed by the idea and was driven to come up with a method of doing so. Although he didn't attend the usual schools of his day, his parents saw to his education by means of various tutors in the fields of chemistry, mathematics, and physics. The premise of being in the right place at the right time was also true of Marconi. His was the heady era of pioneering greats like Heinrich Rudolf Hertz. No, not the car rental guy that hired some murderous dude named after a fruity drink to advertise his sketchy business, but the one that discovered electromagnetic and radio waves after studying the connection between electricity and magnetism. This particular eureka moment probably happened when he energized a large coil of wire with 1.21 gigawatts of power, and it sucked the loose change right out of his pocket. Oddly, Hertz didn't think that the radio wave thing had any real practical purpose, so he didn't bother pursuing further research on the topic. Another contemporaneous guy that played a role in Marconi's life went by the name of James Clerk Maxwell. No, not the one that flogs what should be coffee in blue cans, but is actually an agglomeration of floor sweepings and discarded dental fillings, but the fellow that spearheaded research into the theory of electromagnetic radiation. His buddy Hertz was able to demonstrate that the theory could be proved practically, but again, he thought that magically fishing sundry items out of suit pockets is probably best left to parlor magicians, and went off to pursue other interests, like finger painting and deep breathing. Marconi thought to himself, I can borrow from these guys' research and apply it to my need to talk to people on the other side of the pond, and eventually came up with this. Although not the original, this particular imitation whatchamacallit is technically a monopole antenna attached to a spark gap transmitter, which does its magic by using high voltage to jump a spark across a gap. Hey, wait, that's just like the name of the Who's It. Neat. Anyway, it would have sounded something like this. Eventually, Marconi turned the juice up all the way, and on the night of December 12, 1901, was able to transmit the letter S in Morse code from Poldhu Point in England to Signal Hill, Newfoundland. What a time to be alive! However, as amazing as it was to be able to transmit the singular letter S across a long distance, it wasn't really something your average family would want to spend evenings listening to over and over again, even if it would have been done by professional musicians like Drake or otherwise gifted individuals. This is where Mr. Fessenden entered the historical scene. He thought to himself, although the letter S is super important because the word superciliousness starts and ends with that very letter, how would one go about communicating with the whole world using whole words assembled into whole sentences? And went to work figuring all that out. Well, joking aside, the issue at hand was how to transmit weather information over long distances without having to run telegraph cable, and the United States Weather Bureau asked Fessenden with figuring this all out. The year? 1900. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, which is hopefully a credible source, the problem Fessenden had to overcome was that early radio transmitters could only transmit information by telegraphy, using short and long electric pulses to communicate by Morse code. However, this was impractical for complicated weather information. So he combined a basic radio transmitter with a specially designed interrupter linked to an induction coil, as one does, I guess. Doing so allowed Fessenden to modify the carrier's signal oscillation strength, otherwise known as amplitude, to include sound signals. Fessenden had discovered the principle of amplitude modulation. Then, on December 23, 1900, he successfully transmitted his voice over a distance of 1.6 kilometers for the first time using amplitude modulation, otherwise known as AM radio. His message? Hello. 1, 2, 3, 4. Is it snowing where you are, Mr. Thiessen? How very original. I mean, hello, December, winter and all that. Anyway, the bottom line not to be missed is that the era of modern radio was invented by a Canadian, which can be added to the long list of other things of Kanuckistani origin we take for granted, like pablum, or the humble paint roller, the Wonder Bra, and even something called the Weevac 6. Moving on. The following years were spent by a variety of individuals working at improving the technology to the point where it went from being a novelty to becoming a mass medium by the end of 1940. The first commercial radio station in Canada was in Montreal, and it went on the air in 1919 with a call sign XWA. By the end of 1932, there were 77 licensed stations on the air. They brought all sorts of good listening to the average Canuck that could afford the receiver and license to operate it. Live music, social discussion, political debates, sports, and theatrical plays with plot lines thin enough to see through. Even in the midst of the Great Depression, the radio industry was growing, with sales of radio sets by 1931 jumping to 173,200. The years that followed saw the development of FM, or frequency modulation radio, and then eventually a variety of other digital broadcast technologies that we all take for granted now. Of course, the Government of Canada decided that it too needed to be in on the action, and in 1932 formed the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission. It eventually became the CBC in 1936, and, well, is still plaguing those north of the border today. Things were looking really good for the burgeoning industry, until the arrival of Canadian television in 1952. This spelled disaster for radio's golden age. As Canadian families acquired television sets, evening radio lost money, listeners, and eventually popular programs. Even the CBC officially recognized the change in radio significance by closing down the Dominion Network in 1962. There is much more that could have been added to this particular documentary, but the one thing that stood out in researching this was something Canadian regulators implemented in the 1920s. A policy that prohibited broadcasters from airing commercial breaks between the hours of 6:30 and 11 p.m. Just imagine, you were able to spend an entire evening listening to the wireless without being hammered by ads for monster truck racing, scalp medication, or even adult diapers. Again, what a time to be alive. The radio tower that you've been staring at for the last several minutes is located in Halton Hills, Ontario, and is owned and operated by Evanov Communications, who run a number of radio stations across Kanuckistan. It's a Class B transmitter for those curious, and it barbecues birds all day long at a rate of 1,000 watts of broadcast bonanza. At night, when the birds hit the sack, they ratchet it down to a mere 250 watts. Just enough to keep bats from roosting at the 750-foot level that is the top of the tower. It broadcasts the Canadian radio station CHLO in all the scratchy glory that is regular AM, and also HD AM for absolute clarity. I mean, who would want to miss out on this?
Super talented singing sensation Sean Love Tour. Live in concert.
As always, thank you for watching.